Cashin stepped closer, his voice sharp but calm. We need to act fast. If we give them any more time to regroup, they might become more dangerous. Elise nodded. Agreed. We'll confront them directly. Let them know this city isn't theirs to reclaim. Margot gave a firm nod, her hand resting on the hilt of her dagger. If they decide to fight, we'll need to end it quickly. No hesitation. There was a brief silence, and then Elise motioned to Cashin and Margot. Let's go. They moved with purpose, darting from one shadow to the next, careful not to alert the men inside the warehouse to their presence. As they neared the entrance, Elise could hear their muffled voices clearer, each word more desperate than the last. They were gathering themselves for something, Elise realized. Maybe they were about to make their move. Cashin gestured for them to stop, his eyes scanning the area. He whispered, "We need to surround them. Make sure they don't get away." Elise's heart beat a little faster, but the decision was clear. They would confront these remnants of Vale's reign and show them that they no longer had power here. Valmorn was no longer a place for the corrupt. It was a place for rebirth. Without another word, they moved closer, carefully slipping through the cracks in the old building's exterior to get inside. Elise's breath came softly, deliberately as she crept forward, the dim light from the far-off torches, casting long shadows over the dilapidated walls. Inside the warehouse, the former enforcers were still in disarray. Some were leaning against the walls, others huddled in small groups, whispering about how they could make their next move. Elise's gaze settled on a man standing near the center of the room, his back to her. He was tall, with a broad frame, wearing the same tattered uniform that the soldiers of Vale's guard had once worn. His face, however, was lined with uncertainty. "This is it," Elise whispered. "We'll confront them now." Margot and Cashin both nodded, moving to flank Elise as she stepped into the open space of the warehouse, her presence commanding the attention of the group. She wasn't here for a fight. Not yet, but they needed to know that she was in control. "Enough!" Elise's voice rang out, sharp and unyielding. The men froze, their heads snapping toward her. Their expressions were a mix of surprise and suspicion. The tall man who had been standing in the center stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword that he had clearly prepared for something far more violent. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice gruff. "What do you want, traitor?" Elise's gaze never wavered as she looked him in the eye. "What I want is simple. Valmorn doesn't belong to you anymore. It doesn't belong to Vale. It belongs to the people, to the ones who have been waiting for a chance to rise, to build something better." There was a moment of silence as the man studied her, his expression hard. He glanced at his comrades, who were now shifting uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. Elise could sense their hesitation. "You don't know what you're talking about," the man spat. "You think you can just tear down everything Vale built. This city, this world needs power. It needs order. You're just a fool who doesn't understand the truth of things." Elise's heart hammered in her chest, but she stood firm. "The truth is this. What Vale built wasn't order. It was a prison. It was a lie. The city isn't built on fear or tyranny. It's built on hope, on people who are willing to work together for a common cause. You can keep trying to hold on to the past, but it's already gone." The man took a step forward, his eyes flashing with anger. "You'll regret this." At that moment, Elise saw the flash of a blade. One of the enforcers had drawn a knife from his belt, moving swiftly toward her. Without hesitation, Cassian stepped in front of her, his hand coming down hard on the wrist of the assailant, pinning it to the floor. "Don't," Cassian warned coldly, his voice steady but full of authority. "If you want to keep breathing, I suggest you put that down." The group of men shifted, uncertain whether to fight or to flee. The tall man, still staring Elise down, seemed to be weighing his options. He looked at her, then at Cassian and Margot, who were positioned on either side of her, their stances ready. Then, to Elise's surprise, the man slowly lowered his weapon. "We'll leave," he said, his voice tinged with reluctant surrender. "But mark my words, girl, this isn't over. There are others who still believe in the old ways. You can't stop them all." Elise stepped forward, her voice calm but unyielding. "I'm not trying to stop anyone. I'm trying to build something better. And if you're smart, you'll join us. You'll help rebuild Velmore, not tear it down again." The tall man stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then, with a sharp nod, he motioned for his men to follow. Without another word, they turned and disappeared into the shadows, vanishing into the night. Elise exhaled, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing as the group disappeared into the darkness. But her sense of relief was short-lived. She knew this was only a small victory, one of many battles that would have to be fought. Cassian's hand gently touched her shoulder, his presence a steady reassurance. "You handled that well." Elise nodded, though she didn't feel victorious. "Not yet. It's not over, Cassian. Not by a long shot." Margot was already moving toward the exit, her eyes scanning the surroundings as they prepared to leave. "The people are still watching," she said. "We need to make sure they know we're in control. Know that the old ways won't return." "I know," Elise said, her voice firm. "And we will show them. Velmorn belongs to the people now, and no one is going to take that away from us." With that, they turned and began to make their way back through the streets of Velmorn, knowing that the path ahead would still be filled with obstacles. But Elise was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. She had fought for this city before, and she would fight for it again. Every step of the way. This was her city now, and no shadow, no force, no enemy would ever take it from her. As the days following their confrontation with the former enforcers passed, the energy in Velmorn shifted once again. The streets, once simmering with the tension of unspoken threats, now hummed with the sound of rebuilding. Every brick laid, every new foundation forged was a silent declaration that the old world, the world of Vale, and his cruel reign had no hold over them anymore. Yet, Elise knew the fragile peace they had fought for was only the beginning. The encounter with the enforcers had left an indelible mark on her, though not in the way one might expect. It wasn't fear that lingered, but the certainty that there would always be others, those who refused to accept change. Vale's legacy, twisted as it was, had bred many who believed in his vision of control, and their resentment would not be so easily overcome. The battle for Velmorn's soul wasn't won. She could win with just a single confrontation. It was a long game, and Elise had to be prepared for the inevitable. Waves of dissent that would rise against the city's new order. Margot, ever the pragmatic one, seemed to read her thoughts. Over the days that followed, they spent countless hours together, discussing strategies for securing the fragile unity they had started to rebuild. It wasn't enough to drive the remnants of Vale's supporters into the shadows. They needed to make Velmorn a place where people felt their voices mattered, where the illusion of power that had held the city in chains for so long would never take root again. "Elise," Margot said one evening as they met in the council hall, "there are whispers, not just from the former enforcers, but from the merchants and the nobles too. Some are saying that the city's resources are being squandered, that this new order, as you call it, is destabilizing everything." Elise had known this was coming, but hearing it from Margot made it all the more real. It wasn't just the old guard that stood in opposition. It was the established elites, those who had profited from Vale's reign and now saw their power slipping away. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the table as she thought. "They think the people will return to their old ways," she said quietly, her gaze distant. "But they don't understand the people of Velmorn. They've seen what happens when you oppress them for too long. They're not going to stand by and let the city fall back into those hands." Margot studied her for a moment, her face unreadable. "You're right. The people have been through too much to let that happen. But the nobles, the merchants, they're not going to give up their control so easily. If we don't address their concerns, they'll start undermining us from the inside." Elise's eyes narrowed. The system was already beginning to show cracks. The old powers trying to worm their way back into the city's fabric. She couldn't let that happen, but she also knew that to push too hard could fracture everything she had worked so hard to build. "We'll give them a seat at the table," Elise said after a long pause, her voice determined. "But they'll play by our rules. This isn't about returning to the old ways. This is about a new Velmorn, one where the voices of the people matter most." Cashin, who had been standing by the door, stepped forward. "How do we handle those who resist? Not just the nobles, but the ones still clinging to Vale's vision. What if they try to rally again?" Elise turned to him, meeting his gaze with resolve. "We've already shown them once that we won't tolerate rebellion, but we need to make sure that our message is clear. Those who try to divide, US will be dealt with swiftly, but we won't become the tyrants they were. We will offer a chance for redemption, but only if they truly want it." There was a moment of silence in the room, the weight of Elise's words hanging heavy in the air. The future of Velmorn was uncertain, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But there was no turning back now. Elise had committed herself to this cause, and no matter how difficult the path, she would walk it until the end. Weeks passed, and Elise's resolve was tested again and again. The merchants and nobles were beginning to test the boundaries of her patience, seeking greater control over the city's resources. They pushed for more influence, more power. They even suggested that Velmorn would fail without their leadership. But Elise, now hardened by the weight of leadership, refused to bend. The council meetings became battlegrounds of words, each side vying for their own vision of the city's future. Some of the more stubborn nobles demanded the return of their privileges, while the merchants argued that they were the lifeblood of the city's economy, and without their input, Velmorn would crumble. Through it all, Elise remained calm, her voice unwavering, reminding them that Velmorn's future was in the hands of the people, not a few powerful families. Every time they pushed, she pushed back, using their own words against them, refusing to allow them to return to the old ways of exploitation and corruption. But it wasn't just the old elites that tested her resolve. In the streets, whispers of dissent began to spread. Some of the people, those who had suffered most under Vale's rule, began to question whether the changes Elise had promised were truly being realized. Food prices were rising. Jobs were still scarce. The promise of equality seemed distant. And as the city's reconstruction continued, it became clear that the challenges were far from over. It was during one of the most tense council meetings that Elise realized how fragile everything truly was. As she addressed the growing concerns of the people, one of the older council members, a former ally, stood up and called her out. "Elise," he said, his voice shaking with accusation, "you claim to fight for the people, but how can we trust you when the city is falling apart? Where is the prosperity you promised? Where is the justice?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Elise felt the eyes of the council on her, the weight of the people's hopes pressing down upon her. She could feel the cracks forming beneath her feet. But Elise was not one to back down. Slowly, she stood up from her seat, her eyes sweeping across the room. "The city is in ruins. We all know that. But we are rebuilding it, brick by brick. This will not be easy. There will be hardship. There will be sacrifice. But we will rebuild, not for the few, but for everyone. We will make this city a place of justice and equality, not just in name, but in reality." Her words rang through the hall, and for the first time, Elise realized the full weight of what she was asking. To rebuild Valmorn wasn't just about physical reconstruction. It was about tearing down the old systems of power, the old ways of thinking, and replacing them with something better, a society built on trust, cooperation, and shared prosperity. She glanced at the council members, her gaze steady and unflinching. "I am not asking for your loyalty. I am asking for your faith. In the people, in the future, in Valmorn." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, one by one, the council members nodded, the tension in the room slowly easing. Elise had not won their loyalty, not yet, but she had reminded them of the promise they had all once shared, the promise of a city reborn. The days turned into months and the struggle continued. Though Elise felt the cracks in her resolve beginning to heal, she was no longer fighting alone. The people were with her, those who believed in the new Valmorn, who saw in her the embodiment of their hope. She saw them in the streets, their faces determined, their hands working together to shape a city that could stand on its own, without fear. But as she stood at the heart of Valmorn, watching the city come to life again, Elise knew that the future was still uncertain. There were still those who sought to undermine the progress they had made. There were still shadows that crept into the corners of the city, reminding her of the past they were trying to leave behind. But Elise was no longer afraid. She had chosen this path. She had chosen to be the one who would forge the future. And no matter the obstacles ahead, she would see it through. Valmorn would rise from the ashes, not because of power or fear, but because of the people who had chosen to believe in something better. The days began to blur into one another as Valmorn's pulse continued to quicken. The city, now alive with energy and movement, seemed to reflect the shift that was taking place in Elise herself. It had been months since the battle for its future had started, and she could see the transformation beginning, though it was still fragile. The people were rebuilding, but the shadows of the past, those old forces that had once ruled with terror and oppression, were never far behind. Elise knew that as long as remnants of Vale's regime were left unchallenged, there could be no true peace. They had scattered and gone underground. But Elise could feel them, lurking in the silence, waiting for a moment of weakness. And while the people had rallied around her, she couldn't ignore the whispers that still gripped the city, doubts that nagged at the foundation of everything she had worked so hard to build. As she walked through the busy streets one afternoon, her footsteps echoing softly against the cobblestones, Elise couldn't help but notice how much Velmorn had changed. The once dying city now had life. People moved with purpose, their faces bright with determination as they rebuilt homes, markets and schools. Children played in the alleys, their laughter the soundtrack to a new generation of hope. But even as she admired the progress, Elise could sense an underlying tension, a kind of quiet unease that hung in the air. She stopped near the edge of a market square, watching a group of vendors unloading crates of produce. The market was bustling with activity, but there was a heaviness to the way people moved now, as if they were waiting for something they couldn't quite name. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Elise. She turned to see Casham, his expression as unreadable as ever, though there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes. What's wrong? She asked, sensing that the tension had followed him. It's the northern border, he said, his voice low. There have been signs small, but unmistakable that Vale's supporters are regrouping. Not in the city, but near the outskirts, along the edge of the old territories. Elise felt a chill run down her spine. How many? Not many, he replied, but enough to be a problem. And they've been gathering in secret. No one can say for sure what they're planning, but we both know they won't sit idly by for long. A surge of urgency hit Elise, her heart pounding in her chest. They couldn't afford to let the old guard gain any ground. Not now. Not when the people were finally starting to trust again. She had to make sure they understood, that they would not fall into the same patterns that had destroyed their city once before. When do they plan to strike? She asked, her voice steady. Castian's eyes were full of uncertainty. They're still trying to organize, but they're getting bolder. We've seen signs of coordination, clandestine meetings, secret shipments coming through the northern pass. They might be waiting for something, Elise. A moment of weakness, perhaps. But it's clear they're preparing. Elise didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to wait. Then we'll act now. We'll confront them before they have the chance to strike. I won't let this city slip back into their hands. Cashin nodded, though there was a flicker of concern in his gaze. Elise, this isn't going to be like last time. If they're gathering forces, we need to be ready for a fight. A real one. I know, she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. But we can't let them destroy everything we've built. With that, they set off, assembling a group of trusted allies and preparing to head to the northern border. The journey was long, and the closer they got to the outskirts of the city, the more the air seemed to thicken with the weight of impending confrontation. The roads were quieter here, the distant sound of the market and the cities. Life muted as they neared the territories where Vale's influence had once been strongest. As they approached the edge of the northern border, Elise felt the tension mount. It was a part of Velmorn she hadn't seen in years. Barren stretch of land where Vale's influence had withered, but never fully disappeared. The old guard had always been a thorn in the city's side, and it was clear they hadn't given up. This wasn't just about power anymore. It was about reclaiming what they believed was theirs. Their attempt to rebuild their empire would not go unnoticed. They reached a clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon. the last traces of light casting a dim glow over the landscape. The wind had picked up, swirling the dust around their feet as they crouched low, surveying the camp up ahead. From their vantage point, they could make out figures moving around a large fire, their faces shadowed by the low light. "Do you think it's enough?" Margot asked softly, her voice barely audible as she squatted beside Elise. "Is it worth risking everything?" Elise looked out over the camp, her mind racing. The risk was enormous, but there was no other choice. If they didn't act now, if they didn't crush this insurrection before it had the chance to take root, everything they had fought for would be in jeopardy. "We'll move tonight," Elise said firmly, her voice cold with the weight of the decision. "We can't afford to wait any longer. The moment we let them gather strength is the moment we lose control." Cashin, ever the strategist, gave a quick nod. "We strike fast. Hit them before they know what's happening." Elise felt a moment of hesitation, a flicker of doubt. She'd never been one to turn away from a fight, but the stakes felt higher this time. This wasn't just about stopping an enemy. This was about protecting everything she had worked for: the future of Velmorn, the lives of the people who depended on her. But in the end, there was no other choice. This was the city's last chance to stand firm, to prove that they would not fall back into the grip of the old ways. With a deep breath, Elise motioned for the group to move forward, their movements synchronized and precise. They approached the camp silently, the soft crunch of their footsteps barely noticeable against the wind's howling. The crackling fire ahead illuminated the dark figures around it, but they were still unaware of the impending danger. Elise could feel the weight of every decision she had made in that moment. This battle wasn't just for Velmorn's survival, it was for its soul. If they were to succeed, it would be a victory for all of them. But if they failed, the city's future would be uncertain once more. They were upon them in an instant. The first figure collapsed before he even had time to react, Margot's dagger slipping into his side with deadly precision. Cashin followed, his blade flashing in the dim light as he dispatched another guard. The camp erupted into chaos as the remaining figures scrambled for weapons, their voices raised in confusion. But Elise was not distracted. She saw the leader, the tall man who had once challenged her in the warehouse. He was already on his feet, drawing his sword, his face a mask of fury and defiance. His eyes locked with hers across the firelight, and for a moment, everything around them seemed to still. "This is your last chance," Elise called to him, her voice cutting through the noise. "You can walk away, or you can fight, but I will not let you take this city from the people." The man's lip curled into a sneer. "You're a fool, Elise. The people will never follow you. You're just a shadow of what this city used to be. You'll fail. You always do." But Elise did not flinch. "Then let's see who truly controls this city." And with that, the fight began in earnest. Elise's heart raced, the adrenaline surging through her veins. This was what she had prepared for. This was the moment that would decide everything. It was a battle for more than just survival. It was a battle for the soul of Velmorn, and Elise was ready to claim it for the people. The clash of steel and the shouts of combat filled the air as the night descended into chaos. Elise's heart raced with each movement, each breath a reminder of the weight of the moment. The battle unfolded around her like a storm, each strike a desperate attempt to secure their future. She could hear Cashin and Margot moving through the chaos, the sound of their blades cutting through the night. As they struck down, Thale's supporters one by one, but her focus remained on the man who had challenged her, the one who seemed to carry the remnants of Thale's oppressive legacy in his every movement. His name was Thorn, a former officer under Vale's regime, who had risen through the ranks with ruthless ambition. He was everything that had once kept the city shackled, the embodiment of control, of power wielded without mercy. Elise had faced him before, but never like this, never with everything on the line. Thorn's eyes glinted with malice as he lunged toward her, his sword raised high. Elise didn't hesitate. She met his strike with a swift parry, the force of the blow reverberating through her arm. They moved in a deadly dance, circling each other, each one waiting for the other to make a mistake. The fire crackled nearby, casting long shadows across the battlefield. But Elisa's focus was solely on him. "You don't understand," Thorn growled, his voice full of contempt. "This city is mine. It always has been." Vale was a vision, a promise of order and strength. And you're nothing but a fleeting dream, a fragile hope that will break as soon as the winds shift. Elise's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening around her sword. "You don't get it, Thorn. This city belongs to the people now, not to you, not to Vale. This is their fight, not yours, and I'll make sure it stays that way." Thorn let out a dark laugh, his eyes cold. "You think you can stop me? You think the people will stand with you forever? They are weak. They'll abandon you the moment things get hard." His words were like a knife, meant to wound, to sow doubt in her heart. But Elisa's resolve was unshaken. She had fought too hard to let someone like him, someone who represented everything they had fought to overthrow, break her spirit. She knew the people, knew what they were capable of when they believed in something greater than fear. With a swift motion, Elise lunged forward, her sword finding its mark as she dodged his counterstrike. Thorn staggered back, a look of surprise flickering across his face as he caught his breath. For the first time in their duel, the balance seemed to shift in her favor. She pressed the advantage, her movements fluid and precise, the firelight reflecting off her blade as she parried his strikes with renewed intensity. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the fight. "The people won't abandon me. They won't abandon this city, because we've already seen what happens when we let men like you rule." Thorn gritted his teeth, his eyes narrowing. "Then you're more deluded than I thought." But Elise wasn't listening anymore. She saw the weakness in his movements, the hesitation that had begun to creep into his stance. He wasn't the same man who had commanded the city under Vale's reign. He was a remnant, a ghost of a time long past, and she would end it here. With one final, swift motion, she disarmed him, sending his sword clattering to the ground. Thorn stumbled back, his breath ragged as he raised his hands in surrender. "You may have won this fight, Elise, but mark my words, this is not the end. You cannot keep control forever. You will falter. You will fail." Elise stood over him, her chest rising and falling with each breath, the weight of her victory settling on her shoulders. "I won't fail, because this city belongs to the people. And as long as they stand with me, no one will take it from us." The fire crackled as the battle around them began to subside. The remaining fighters, those who had followed Thorn and Vale's legacy, were either captured or scattered, defeated in the face of the city's united front. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of victory, but also the knowledge that this fight, was only one chapter in a much longer struggle. Cashin and Margot approached, their faces grim but resolute. "We've cleared the camp," Margot said, her voice low. "It's over." Elise nodded, but her eyes never left Thorn. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the defiance still burning in him even as he knelt on the ground. It was a reminder that the war wasn't won with one battle. It was won through the persistence of the people, the unity that could withstand even the greatest storms. Thorn sneered up at her. "You're a fool, Elise. You think you can change this city. You're nothing but a shadow." A fleeting moment in time. Elise stepped closer to him, her voice quiet but full of conviction. "Maybe. But shadows are born of light, and as long as the people of Velmorn keep shining, will never fade." She motioned for the guards to take him into custody, and as they led him away, Elise felt the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She had won this battle, but the war, the true fight for Velmorn's soul, was far from over. The weeks that followed were a blur of rebuilding and reconciliation. Thorn's defeat was a significant blow to the remnants of Vale's supporters. But Elise knew that this wasn't the end. There would always be others who would try to seize power, others who would seek to undermine the progress they had made. But the people of Velmorn had shown their resilience. They had proven that they were willing to fight, to stand together no matter the cost. Elise spent her days among them, listening to their concerns, working tirelessly to address the issues that still plagued the city. The reconstruction efforts continued, but so did the work of healing the divisions that had once torn Velmorn apart. It was a delicate balance, building trust while navigating the old wounds that still ran deep, but Elise believed in the people, in their strength and their ability to rise above their past. And in the quiet moments, when the noise of the city died down and the weight of the day lifted, Elise would walk through the streets of Velmorn, her heart swelling with a sense of pride. She had always known that this city was capable of greatness. But now, as she looked around at the bustling markets, the children playing in the streets, and the people who had come together to rebuild what had once been broken, she realized something deeper. This city was more than just a place. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. She had fought not just for Velmorn, but for a future where its people would never have to live in fear again. And in that quiet victory, Elise knew that the legacy of the shadowed lover, the love for the people, the love for a city reborn, would outlast even the darkest of times. Because Velmorn, like the people who called it home, was stronger than anything that sought to destroy it. And as long as there was hope, as long as there was unity, it would never fall again. As the days turned into months, Velmorn continued to rebuild itself, piece by piece, as though the very ground had been soaked in hope, drying under the light of newfound unity. Elise's role had shifted from that of a leader on the front lines of a rebellion to one of a nurturer, nurturing the city's future, nurturing its people, and even nurturing the fragile trust that had taken root among the fractured factions of the city. But the scars of the past were not so easily erased. The remnants of Vale's influence still simmered beneath the surface, subtle yet potent, lingering like the smoke of a fire long extinguished but still carrying a hint of heat. Elise knew that peace, if it was to last, had to be maintained with more than just hope. It needed vigilance, consistency, and the commitment of every citizen to fight against complacency. One afternoon, after another long day of meetings and negotiations with the council, Elise walked through the gardens of the palace. The term palace was still a stretch for the modest structure that had once been Vale's personal headquarters. It had been gutted and repaired, but there were still sections that reminded her of the man who had once lived there, of the times when power had been held in the hands of just a few. But this garden, which had once been a place of isolation for its previous ruler, was now a symbol of life. The flowers had bloomed again, the trees stood tall, and the vines clung to the walls like a promise that the city too would thrive. Elise wandered among the flowers, the soft hum of the city's distant noise fading into the background. Cashin found her there as the sun began to dip low, casting golden hues across the garden. He had grown into a quiet strength, not as brash as he once had been, but still fiercely protective of her, and of the city they both loved. His eyes met hers as he stepped closer, the familiarity between them both comforting and unsettling at once. "You've been distant," he said, his voice gentle but tinged with concern. Elise shrugged, a half-hearted smile tugging at her lips. "There's always more to do. The work is never ending." Cashin didn't argue. He knew the weight of leadership better than anyone, but there was something else in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in a long time. Doubt. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his gaze softening. Elise was silent for a long moment, watching a bird flutter from one branch to another in the distance. Finally, she spoke. "I'm not sure we're doing enough. I've led the fight, Cashin. But what happens when the next threat comes? What happens when the people forget what it cost us to get here?" He came to stand beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. "You're thinking too much. You've done more than anyone ever could." "I don't know, Cashin," she murmured, her voice growing softer, more reflective. "I look around, and sometimes I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something fragile. It's like there's always a shadow looming. What if the peace we fought for slips through our fingers?" Cashin didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip warm and grounding. "Peace is never permanent, Elise. It's something we have to fight for every day. But don't forget what you've accomplished. What we've accomplished." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his for some sign that he too understood the weight of her doubts. "And what if the people lose faith? What if the old ways return? I can't let that happen." "You won't," he said, his voice certain. "The people follow you because they believe in you, Elise. Not because of the battles you've fought, but because of the vision you've given them. You've shown them what it means to fight for something greater, and they will carry that forward, just as you have." But Elise couldn't shake the feeling of impending change, like a storm building on the horizon. No matter how many victories she had claimed, the shadow of the past was always a whisper in the back of her mind. And if history had taught her anything, it was that the price of freedom was never free. The city was resilient, yes, but the people, in their fleeting moments of peace, often forgot how easily that peace could be shattered. As if on cue, a messenger appeared in the distance, his figure moving briskly toward them. He had a look of urgency, and when he reached them, his eyes were wide with concern. "Lady Elise," the man said, bowing quickly. "There's been trouble in the southern quarter. Riots, protests. The streets are flooded with people demanding answers. They say the city is broken, and that the new leadership is just a shadow of the old." Elise's stomach tightened. She had been expecting this, though not so soon. The rumors, the dissent, it was inevitable. People always feared change. especially after the fall of a regime that had held such power for so long. We'll handle it, Cashin said before Elise could respond. His voice was low, but his eyes were sharp with resolve. But Elise knew that this wasn't a matter of controlling the situation, it was a matter of understanding why the people were protesting. And if there was one thing she'd learned in her time leading Velmorn, it was that appeasing the crowd wasn't enough. She needed to listen to them, to understand what was driving them to act out against the very system they had once supported. "Gather the council," she said, her voice steady, her earlier doubt replaced with a sense of determination. "We're going to the Southern Quarter. I want to hear what they have to say." The Southern Quarter was a place of mixed fortune. On the one hand, it had become a hub for the city's emerging arts and culture. It was the beating heart of Velmorn's revitalization, full of hope and ambition. On the other hand, it had always been one of the poorest districts, a place where the scars of Vale's rule had lingered, long after the regime's collapse. As Elise walked through the crowded streets, flanked by Cashin and several of the council members, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the anger in the air. The protesters were a mix of the old and the new, people who had lived under Vale's thumb and people who had hoped for a new life under Elise's leadership. They were frustrated, confused, and desperate. "What do you want?" Elise called out, raising her voice so it could carry over the crowd. She had to be heard if she was going to get through to them. A man at the front of the crowd stepped forward, his face twisted in bitterness. "We want the truth. You promised us change, but all we see are the same old problems: hunger, poverty, corruption. How are you any different from Vale? You've promised us a new beginning, but all we have are broken promises." The words cut through Elise like a blade. She knew these were the very same frustrations that had festered under Vale's reign. These were the feelings of abandonment and hopelessness that had driven so many to support the former ruler in the first place. "I am not Vale," Elise said, her voice firm but not without empathy. "I know the city is not perfect. I know that the promises we made have not yet been fully realized. But I'm not here to give you easy answers. I'm here to fight with you, to build something better together." There was a murmur in the crowd. Some faces softened, while others remained hard with distrust. "You fought for us before, Elise," one woman called from the back. "But how much longer can we wait? How much longer before we see real change?" Elise met the woman's gaze, her heart heavy with the realization that she was not just fighting for the future of Velmorn, but for its very soul. This wasn't a battle against an enemy. It was a battle against the broken system that had left these people abandoned for so long. They needed to believe again, to see a path forward. And that was something that couldn't be solved overnight. "I don't have all the answers," Elise said quietly, her voice carrying over the crowd. "But I promise you this: I will not stop fighting for you. Together, we will build a future worthy of the sacrifices we've made. But we have to keep moving forward. We can't let the past control us. Not anymore." The silence that followed was heavy. But there was something in the air, something that shifted, just slightly. Maybe it was the way her words seemed to settle, or maybe it was the sheer truth of her conviction. Elise didn't know, but she could feel the change, subtle yet powerful. The people were listening. They were starting to believe again. The storm that had threatened the city, the shadow of doubt that had followed her, began to recede. For the first time in a long while, Elise could see the light ahead. The shift in the crowd was palpable. a quiet understanding settling over the southern quarter like the calm after a storm. The murmurs among the protesters grew softer, their anger muted by the sincerity in Elisa's voice. She had spoken not as a ruler, but as one of them, a fellow citizen who, though burdened with power, shared in their struggles, in their hopes for something better. Cashin, ever the pragmatist, watched the crowd closely, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had begun to lower their fists, some even nodding in reluctant agreement. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the lingering tension. "We've heard you," he said, his tone less commanding than usual, softer, inviting. "But we need you to help us too. Change doesn't come from the top down. It comes from everyone together." Elise turned to him, her heart warmed by the unexpected partnership they had built. One forged in the fires of battle and now strengthened by shared purpose. She knew that Cashin, in his own way, was as much a leader as she was. They complemented each other in ways that neither had fully realized until now. The protesters hesitated, eyes flickering between the two of them. The fire in their expressions was no longer one of blind rage, but of wary hope, a hope that felt fragile, as if it could shatter with the wrong word or gesture. Elise knew she had to tread carefully, but she also knew she couldn't afford to back down. "Listen," she began again, her voice more measured this time. "I understand your anger. I see the hunger and the pain, the scars of the old world that still haunt us. I can't promise you everything at once, but I can promise you this. We will build a new future, together. And that means more than just words. It means action. It means accountability." A man from the back of the crowd spoke up, his voice loud but tinged with uncertainty. "Accountability? How can we trust you? How can we trust any of you when those who helped build the old regimes still walk free, still hold power in the shadows?" Elisa's heart sank at his words. The scars of the old regime were still fresh, and it was impossible to ignore the fact that many of Vale's former allies, those who had profited from the suffering of the people, remained influential figures in the city. Elise had promised to root out corruption, but the reality of that task was daunting. How could she prove that her vision for Velmorn was truly different from the past? She took a deep breath, stepping forward to face the man, her eyes steady. "You're right," she said, her voice carrying through the crowd. "There are people in positions of power who are part of the old system, and I will not shy away from holding them accountable. But I need your help to do that. We need to expose them, bring them into the light, and make sure that no one matter their past, can wield power over the people again. It won't be easy, but we'll do it together." The man stared at her, searching her face for any hint of deception. The crowd was still uncertain, but there was a flicker of something in the air, something that hadn't been there before. Hope, yes, but more than that. Trust. Elise turned to Cashin, who gave her a quick nod. He, too, understood the gravity of what she was saying. The task ahead of them was monumental, but it was one they could face if they worked as a unified front. "We'll take action," Cashin said, his voice strong now. "We'll start with the corrupt officials, with the remnants of Vale's regime, who continue to hold sway over the people. We'll expose them, and we'll make sure they are held accountable for what they've done. But it starts with us. It starts with you, standing here today, choosing to be part of the solution instead of letting the past pull us back." For a long moment, the crowd remained silent. Elise could see the uncertainty in their eyes, but she could also see something else, the faintest spark of belief. It was fragile, like a flame in the wind, but it was there. And for the first time in months, Elise felt a deep sense of connection with the people she had fought for. They weren't just looking to her for leadership. They were looking to themselves, to each other, to be part of the change that was needed. The tension in the air slowly began to dissolve. People started to step forward, tentative at first, but then with more confidence. A few began to clap, the sound slowly building until it became a steady rhythm, one that echoed through the streets. It wasn't applause for Elise or cash in it was applause for themselves, for the choice they had made to stand together and face the future as a united force. Elise allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, to take in the sight of the people she had fought to protect, their faces now lit with something akin to hope. But she knew that this was only the beginning. The path ahead would not be easy. There were still so many challenges to overcome. There would be moments when doubt would creep in again, when the weight of her promises might feel too heavy to bear. But for now, this moment was enough. This brief glimpse of unity was a promise of things to come. As the crowd began to disperse, some returning to their homes, others lingering to talk among themselves, Elise felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Margot standing beside her, her expression unreadable but her eyes soft with understanding. "You did well," Margot said quietly, her voice laced with admiration. "The people listen to you." "I don't know if I believe it yet," Elise confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I have to believe that they can change, that we can change." Margot's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on Elise's arm. "You've already started that change, Elise. Don't forget that." The words lingered in the air, and Elise found herself nodding slowly. Maybe Margot was right. Maybe the change had already begun. Not in the grand gestures or promises, but in the small moments like this, when the people of Velmorn stood together, choosing to believe in a different future. As the last of the protesters disappeared into the streets, Elise took a deep breath. The city still had a long way to go, and so did she. But for the first time in a long while, she felt that they could make it. She could make it. The shadows of the past were still there, lingering just beyond the horizon. But as long as the people believed in the light of a new day, they would find the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She turned back toward the palace, her resolve firm. The future of Velmorn was uncertain, but it was no longer dictated by fear or the shadow of a past ruler. It was a future shaped by the choices they made now in this moment. And with that thought in her heart, Elise knew that as long as she had the will to fight, Velmorn would not fall again. Not while the people still believed, and not while she still had breath to carry their hopes forward. As the weeks passed, the shift in Velmorn continued, though not without resistance. The remnants of Vale's influence were still powerful, hiding in the corners of the city, in the whispers of the old guard, and in the complacency of those who had grown used to the old ways. But the will of the people was stronger, and Elise's leadership, tempered by the struggles they had all endured, became a symbol of resilience. Her time was consumed with meetings, strategies, and the slow, often painful process of rebuilding the city's institutions. But more than anything, she worked to heal the wounds that ran deeper than just physical damage, those invisible scars, left by years of oppression, distrust, and fear. She met with citizens from all corners of Velmorn, Not just the elites or the powerful, but the farmers, the craftsmen, the laborers. She listened to their stories, their struggles and their dreams. It was in these moments, when the city felt alive with hope and possibility, that Elise felt the weight of her responsibility more than ever. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that change could happen, that it was happening. But even as she pushed forward, she couldn't escape the feeling that the shadow of the past still loomed over them all. The fear of failure, of losing everything they had fought for, was a constant companion. One evening, as she stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows over the streets, Cashin joined her. He, too, had become an integral part of the city's rebuilding. His sharp instincts and unyielding determination had earned him respect. But it was his quiet dedication to the people that truly made him invaluable. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice low but laced with concern. Elise sighed, turning her gaze away from the horizon. "I can't shake the feeling that we're not done yet, that there's still something we haven't faced. I've been so focused on keeping the peace, on making things better, that I've ignored the fact that the old ways still haunt us." Cashin stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "You're not alone in this. We've all fought for this, together. But you're right. The past doesn't let go easily." She met his gaze, the weight of their shared history pressing down on her shoulders. "I've seen it before, Cashin. In the faces of the people, in the way they look at me, like they're waiting for me to fail. For us to fail. They need more than words, more than promises. They need to see that we can truly change things. There are always going to be those who doubt," Cashin said, his voice steady. "But we've already shown them that we can do more than survive. We've shown them that we can build something new. And as long as we keep fighting for that, we'll make it." Elise nodded slowly, taking comfort in his words, though the fear still gnawed at her. The fear of the unknown. The fear that the fragile peace they had worked so hard to create would shatter like glass under the pressure of the world's expectations. But then she remembered something else, something that Cashin had said to her when they first began this journey. Asterisk. There's always a way forward, even when it feels like there isn't. And so, she resolved to keep moving forward, even when doubt crept in. Even when the past tried to pull them back into its suffocating grip. The following days were filled with more of the same negotiations. Meetings and visits to the outer districts, where the echoes of the old world were still loudest. But Elise knew that true change would not come from the halls of power or from the promises made in the chambers of the council. It would come from the people if they believed in each other, if they trusted in their collective strength. And in that trust, Elise found a glimmer of hope. But the darkness of the past would not be so easily shaken. Not long after their confrontation with the protesters in the southern quarter, a whisper reached Elise's ears, rumors of a group, calling itself the Last Dawn, a faction of Vale's most loyal followers, who had gone underground after the fall of his regime. They were beginning to stir again, plotting in the shadows, organizing discontent among those who still yearned for the old ways of power. Elise couldn't ignore the warning signs. She gathered her closest allies, Cashin, Margot, and a few others, and laid out the information she had received. "There's a danger out there," she said, her voice tight with tension. "The Last Dawn isn't just a group of angry individuals. They're organized, and they're determined to see Vale's legacy rise again. If we don't deal with this quickly, it could undo everything we've worked for. Cashin frowned. His brow furrowed. How do we stop them? We start by finding them, Elise said, her eyes narrowing. We need to root them out before they can spread any further. This isn't just about stopping another uprising. It's about proving that Valmont's future is not in the hands of those who would see it burn for their own gain. Margot, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. But we can't just hunt them down blindly. If we alienate the people, if they start to feel like we're no different from Vale's regime, then we'll lose everything. We have to be careful. I know, Elise replied, her voice hardening with resolve. But we can't afford to wait. If we don't act now, we'll lose control. The group agreed, and their plan began to take shape. They would move quietly, gathering intelligence, finding out who was behind the growing faction, and using the people's trust in them to expose the remnants of Vale's power structure. They couldn't afford to be reckless, but they couldn't afford to ignore the threat either. As the days stretched on, Elise found herself in the center of another battle, not one fought with swords or banners, but with information, influence, and the subtle art of persuasion. Every conversation, every gesture, every choice carried weight. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. And yet, despite the mounting tension and the fear that threatened to choke her at every turn, there were moments when she caught a glimpse of what they were fighting for. It wasn't in the power they wielded, or in the victories they won, but in the quiet moments with the people, those who, though they had suffered the worst of the past, still carried the hope of a better future in their hearts. One evening, as the city bathed in the fading glow of twilight, Elise stood once again in the garden. This time, however, she was not alone. Cashin was with her, his steady presence a comfort amidst the chaos. Do you ever wonder, she asked quietly, if we're doing enough? Cashin didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to her, his gaze thoughtful. Every day. But then I remember that we're not doing this alone. We have each other, and the people who believe in us. Elise looked out over the city, the light of countless candles flickering in the windows of homes, the sounds of the streets slowly quieting as the night settled in. She had fought hard to get to this point, and while the shadows of the past still threatened to rise, she knew that as long as she had the people by her side, they could face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but the one thing she was sure of was that she would never stop fighting for it. As long as there was hope in Valmont, there would be a way forward, and she would find it. The days that followed were steeped in tension, but Elise refused to allow the shadow of fear to cloud her determination. The whispers of the last dawn grew louder, but so did the resolve of Valmont's people to stand against it. Elise knew that the delicate balance of trust and power they had carefully nurtured would be tested in ways they hadn't yet anticipated. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. As she spent more time within the city's inner circles, meeting with leaders of the district unions, merchants, and even former dissidents, she realized that their goal had shifted beyond simply overthrowing the old regime. It had become a battle to prove to the people that the new order was not merely a reaction to the past, but a true promise of something better. Cashin, ever the strategist, worked alongside her in every planning session, tirelessly mapping out the network of the last dawn operatives. He had grown into a leader in his own right, trusted by those who followed Elise. There was a quiet respect between them now, not merely born from mutual hardship, but from an understanding that their combined efforts could shape the future. And yet, despite the progress they made, there was a creeping sense of urgency. Elise could feel it in the air, thick with the scent of rebellion that the last dawn was stoking in the undercurrents of Velmorn. The factions within the city that had once been allies now began to question the new leadership. Would they be able to trust Elise's vision when there were still so many who clung to the old ways? One morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed into the palace, Elise sat alone in her office, poring over documents. The reports on the last dawn were growing darker, their actions bolder. They had targeted key officials in the city, sending a clear message that they had not forgotten the old world, that they were prepared to fight for it. Elise felt the weight of each piece of intelligence, as if it were a brick in the foundation of a crumbling wall. "Cashin," she said quietly as he entered the room, "we need to act now. If we don't stop this soon, the city will tear itself apart. The people are growing restless." Cashin nodded, his face grim. "I know. But we need to be careful. We can't lose the support of the people. If we're too heavy-handed, we'll make martyrs out of them." "I'm not looking to start another war," Elise replied, her voice hardening. "But I won't let this city fall back into the hands of those who only want to exploit it." Castin's gaze softened. "I understand, and will do whatever it takes to stop them." "But Elise," his voice trailed off as he approached her desk, leaning in to examine the reports. "This is bigger than just the last dawn. There's a network here, old contacts, old money, old debts. Vale's influence still lingers, and it's not just in the shadows. We have to expose it all." A silence settled between them, thick with the unspoken truth. Elise knew he was right. The power that the last dawn wielded was not simply from their numbers or their ideology. It was from the webs of corruption that had long entangled the city business interests, political deals, and the dark alliances formed during Vale's reign. To uproot it, they needed more than strategy. They needed to dismantle the very system that allowed it to thrive. "We start with the roots," Elise said, her voice steady. "We expose them, every last one. We show the people that this is not just a fight for power. It's a fight for the soul of Velmorn." Cashin nodded. "Agreed. But we need to bring in more support. We can't do this alone." "I know," Elise replied, her mind already working through the possibilities. She thought of Margot, who had always been loyal, her instincts sharp and unwavering. But the city was vast, and the enemy was no longer a singular entity. It was an entire system, stretching its tendrils deep into the fabric of their society. The next few days were a whirlwind of action. Elise and Cashin gathered their closest allies, people who, like them, had come to believe in the possibility of a new future for Velmorn. They met in the shadows, in dimly lit rooms far from prying eyes. Each conversation weighed with the gravity of the decisions they made. Margot had proven to be invaluable. Her connections, though once limited to the fringes of society, now ran deep in the city's underbelly. She knew where the whispers were coming from, which markets, which taverns, which back alleys were simmering with unrest. Her eyes and ears became crucial as they began to track the movements of the last dawn, understanding not only their plans but their supporters, the disillusioned, the forgotten, the downtrodden. But there was another piece to the puzzle that neither Elise nor Cashin had anticipated. As the unrest grew, so did the tensions within the leadership of Velmorn itself. Old rivalries, once buried under the weight of shared goals, began to resurface. In secret meetings, voices that had once been allies began to question Elisa's methods, her motives. Some believed that the new regime was growing too authoritarian, that she was losing sight of the very ideals they had all fought for. It was one such meeting, held in the grand hall of the council chamber, that nearly tore the fragile unity of their leadership apart. Elise, one of the councillors, began, his voice sharp and cutting through the silence. You talk of justice, of rebuilding Velmorn, but your actions speak of a growing thirst for control. You've turned the people's hope into a weapon, and now you seek to wield it like a blade. The words stung, sharper than any blade Elise had ever known. She had always believed in the nobility of their cause, but hearing the doubt in the voice of one of her closest allies made her question how far she had truly come. Are you suggesting that we do nothing? Elise asked, her tone icy. That we allow the last dawn to tear this city apart, just so we can maintain the illusion of unity? No, the councillor replied, his eyes narrowing. But we must remember who we are fighting for. The people of Velmorn are not children. They deserve more than just promises. They deserve to see that we are truly different from Vale, that we are not here to create another system of power. The room fell silent, and Elise felt the weight of every eye upon her. This was more than just a disagreement. It was a challenge to her leadership, to everything she had worked for. I am fighting for the people, Elise said quietly, her voice trembling with an intensity that surprised even her. I have sacrificed everything for this city. I've bled. I've lost. I've given up my own dreams just to make this possible. So don't tell me I don't understand the cost of this. The councillor looked at her, his face softening with a mixture of regret and guilt. I never doubted your commitment, Elise. But power changes people, and we need to make sure it doesn't change you. Elise took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on her. She knew that she had to make a choice, not just for her own future, but for Velmorn's. If she was to lead, truly lead, she would have to remain grounded in the ideals that had started this revolution. She couldn't let the fight for justice consume her humanity. She nodded slowly, her voice steady once more. I will not become like Vale, but I will not let this city fall. I will fight for its future, even if it means losing everything. The tension in the room eased, but only slightly. The path forward was clearer now. There were no more illusions of easy victories, no more simple choices. But Elise understood now, perhaps for the first time, that true leadership was not just about leading the people forward. It was about holding on to the ideals that had brought them here, no matter the cost. And as long as she had that resolve, there would always be a way forward. She turned to Cashin, who had remained silent through it all, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't need to say anything. She could see it in his eyes, the same fierce determination, the same unshakable belief in the cause. Together they would face the future, and together they would ensure that the shadow of the past would never rise again. The days after the battle were a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and quiet reflection. The streets of Velmorn, once filled with the sounds of conflict, now echoed with a tentative peace. But this peace was fragile, held together by the strength of the people who had fought for it and by the unyielding determination of its leaders. Elise stood on the balcony of the council building, looking out over the city. The morning sun bathed Valmorn in a soft, golden light. But even as she watched the streets begin to fill with people, again merchants setting up their stalls, children playing in the alleys, she couldn't escape the heavy weight pressing down on her. The battle might have been won, that the war for the city's future had only just begun. Cashin joined her, standing silently beside her for a long moment. His presence was a comfort, the quiet strength of his unwavering loyalty, a reminder of everything they had been through together. "We've won the city," Elise said quietly, her voice low but firm. "But I still don't know what it's going to take to heal it." Cashin looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You can't heal it all at once. This is a long road, Elise. A hard one. But we've shown them that it's possible to change. And that's what matters." His words were like balm to a wound, but Elise knew he was right. She had spent so many years fighting for this moment, for this change, that it was hard to grasp the reality of it. She had never imagined that victory would feel so lonely, so isolating. The weight of leadership, of having to carry the hopes of an entire city, was heavier than any battle she had fought. "I can't do it alone," she whispered, the vulnerability slipping out before she could stop it. She had been so strong, so sure of herself, but now she felt like she was on the edge of something she couldn't fully understand. "You're not alone," Cashin replied, his voice steady and sure. "You never have been, and you won't be. We're in this together, for as long as it takes." His words, simple but sincere, were a lifeline. She had always known that she could count on Cashin, but hearing it again, hearing it so plainly, made something inside her heart shift. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. But there was more to be done. Much more. The remnants of the last dawn had been defeated, but their ideas, their vision for the city hadn't disappeared. Valmorn's people were scarred, broken in ways that no battle could fix. The wounds were deep, and it would take time, perhaps years, to rebuild what had been lost. Elise couldn't afford to be complacent. She couldn't simply wait for change to happen. She had to be the one to lead them, to help guide them through the darkness of the past into the light of a new future. "We need to rebuild the trust," Elise said, turning to face Cashin. "The people, they don't know who to believe anymore. There's so much doubt, so much fear. We need to prove to them that we're not just another regime, another group of people who will take advantage of them." Cashin nodded. "It's going to take time. But if anyone can do it, it's you." Elise smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She wasn't sure she believed that anymore, not with all the uncertainty surrounding her, that she would try. She had to. Weeks passed and the city of Valmorn slowly began to heal, though the scars of the battle and the previous regime still remained. Elise worked tirelessly, visiting neighborhoods, speaking to the people, listening to their concerns, and making sure they knew she was there for them. She sought out the disillusioned, those who had been hurt by the last dawn, and tried to show them that there was another way, an honest way, to build their future. The council, once divided, now stood united. Elise's leadership had proven itself in battle, and now it was time to prove itself in governance. It was a delicate balance, keeping the peace between the various factions of Valmorn. But Elise had learned that sometimes the hardest part of leadership wasn't in the decisions you made, it was in the trust you had to build. Cashin remained her closest ally, guiding her through the political maelstrom that often came with rebuilding a fractured city. He was a natural leader in his own right, and Elise often found herself leaning on his judgment as much as her own. Together they made decisions, some small, others monumental, that would shape Valmorn for generations to come. But even as they worked toward this new future, the shadow of the last dawn still loomed. Though their main forces had been scattered, remnants of their followers continued to spread dissent. And Elise knew that, sooner or later, she would have to confront the core of the movement, the ones who had led it, the ones who had whispered in the shadows, fueling the flames of rebellion. One night, after a particularly exhausting council meeting, Elise stood on the balcony of her quarters, staring out over the city. The lights of Valmorn twinkled below, and the sounds of the city filled the air, the bustle of merchants, the laughter of children, the hum of life. But somewhere in the distance, she could still feel the undercurrent of unrest. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. Cashin had joined her on the balcony, standing beside her, looking out at the same city they had both fought so hard to protect. "Every day," he replied softly. "But I don't just think about it. I work for it. I build it." Elise looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of admiration and gratitude. "I couldn't do it without you." He turned to her, his gaze steady. "You never had to. I've always been here, and I always will be." She nodded, her chest tightening. The future, as uncertain as it was something they would build together. But Elise knew that it wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, there would be challenges, and there would always be people who would try to bring the city back into darkness. But she was ready. She had to be. The city was hers to rebuild. And no matter the cost, she would make sure that Valmorn's light would never again be dimmed. And so, with every step Elise took, the shadow of the last dawn retreated further into the past, leaving in its wake a city that was no longer divided by fear, but united by hope. The road ahead would never be free of obstacles, but Elise had learned that the strength of a city lay, not in its walls or its weapons, but in the heart of its people. Together they would rebuild. Together they would rise. And together they would ensure that the light of Valmorn would shine brighter than ever before. The shadowed lover of the city had become its savior. And in her heart, Elise knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter filled with promise, with change, and with the indomitable will to never give up on the dream of a better tomorrow. The days continued to pass, and though the city of Valmorn had made significant strides, the horizon still held a few lingering shadows. Elise's resolve had deepened, but she understood better now that leadership was not a destination. It was a continuous journey, filled with challenges that tested not only her strength, but her ability to remain grounded, to remain true to herself. One morning, as Elise walked through the city, accompanied by Cashin, she couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the air. There was an energy, a hum, among the people. It wasn't the frantic pace of survival, or the tense quiet of fear. It was a hope that was starting to feel contagious, spreading from one person to another like the first. Light of dawn breaking through a long, dark night. But despite these outward signs of progress, there was still unrest. Though the last dawn had been driven from the city, there were pockets of resistance. People still loyal to the ideals that had once threatened Valmorn's very existence. It wasn't just about the physical battles anymore. It was the ideological war. The question of what Velmorn would truly become. Elise had made strides, but there was always a small voice in the back of her mind, whispering that she had yet to fully prove herself, that the peace she had helped create was more fragile than she cared to admit. That day, as they passed through one of the newly established marketplaces, Elise noticed a group of young men in the crowd. They were standing at a corner, speaking in hushed tones, their faces shadowed by the hoods they wore. Elise's sharp eyes caught the glint of something she recognized: symbols. The symbols of the last dawn. Cashin, sensing her tension, stepped closer. "What is it?" "They're still here," she muttered. "The remnants. I thought we rooted them out." He followed her gaze, narrowing his eyes. "They're still here in spirit. Not just the symbols, these people, they believe in something else. They don't trust what we've built." Elise frowned. This was the part of the battle she hadn't anticipated. The ideological war. The physical fights could be won. The leaders of the last dawn defeated. But the seed of what they had preached of power, control, and distrust still lingered in the hearts of many. "What do we do?" Cashin asked, his voice low. "We can't just chase them out," Elise replied. "We have to convince them. We have to show them that this new path, the one we've chosen, is better. That there's a future worth fighting for. One that doesn't come at the cost of lives. At the cost of ideals that have only led to destruction." It was an idea Elise had wrestled with for some time. But the sight of those symbols brought the issue to the forefront. Her city was healing, but it wasn't healed. The foundation was strong, but there were cracks that could easily be widened. And she knew that if they weren't careful, the same forces that had torn Velmorn apart before could rise again. "We can't ignore them," she added. "We need to reach them, not by force, but by showing them what's possible." Over the next few weeks, Elise worked tirelessly to bridge the divide. She began holding open forums, inviting not only her supporters but even the disenfranchised, the ones who had once followed the last dawn as promises. She spoke with a sincerity and rawness that, for the first time, seemed to resonate with them. They didn't just need new laws, new systems, they needed hope. Something that felt tangible. Cashin, ever loyal, helped her navigate the complexities of these delicate conversations. But there were times, especially when the conversations grew heated or when her efforts were met with hostility, when Elise felt the weight of her own fear and doubt pressing down on her once again. One evening, after a particularly difficult meeting with a group of ex-followers from the last dawn, she retreated to her private quarters, seeking solace in the silence. The room was dark except for the faint light of candles flickering along the walls. She sank into a chair, her thoughts heavy. Cashin, sensing her unease, entered quietly, offering her a silent but comforting presence. "I don't know if they'll ever believe in what we're trying to do," Elise admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The wounds run too deep. The lies, they've been told for so long." Cashin sat beside her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Maybe you're right, but even the deepest wounds can heal with time. And if anyone can make them see that, it's you. You've already changed Velmorn. You just have to show them that they're part of that change." Elise looked at him, a faint, tired smile crossing her lips. "I don't know how much longer I can do this. Sometimes it feels like the weight of this city is too much for one person to carry." Cashin took her hand gently, his voice soft but resolute. You don't have to carry it alone. We're all in this together. And that includes them, the people who are still lost. They need us just as much as we need them. Elise stared at their joined hands for a moment, feeling the warmth of his words sink into her. The realization hit her again, but with a greater sense of clarity. Leadership was not about perfection. It wasn't about being the singular force that held everything together. It was about the collective strength, the unity of people coming together for a shared cause. I won't give up on them, she whispered, more to herself than to Cashin. Not while there's still a chance. In the months that followed, Elise focused on community building. She poured herself into creating spaces where dialogue could take place, where people from all walks of life, even those who had once followed the last dawn, could come together and discuss their fears and hopes for the future. She didn't promise immediate solutions, but she offered something much more powerful, a vision of unity and possibility. And slowly, through tireless work and quiet persistence, the walls between the factions began to crumble. The symbols of the last dawn no longer carried the same weight. They became relics of the past, reminders of what could have been and what had been rejected. But just as peace seemed within reach, new shadows began to rise from beyond the city's borders. Word came of unrest in nearby territories, whispers of an alliance forming between some of the most radical remnants of the last dawn and other factions seeking to topple the fragile peace that Valmorn had fought so hard to maintain. The spectre of war, though distant, loomed just beyond the horizon, threatening to undo everything Elise had worked for. And so, as always, the battle continued. But Elise was no longer fighting alone, nor was she merely fighting for Valmorn. She was fighting for a future where fear no longer ruled, a future where the people of Valmorn, united by their shared struggles, could finally embrace the possibility of a world beyond division, beyond the shadows of their past. The journey was long. The road ahead would not be easy. But Elise was no longer afraid of the weight. She had learned that, with Cashin by her side, and the people of Valmorn rallying together, even the darkest of shadows could be banished by the light of hope. As Elise stood on the edge of the city's battlements, watching the horizon darken with the threat of a new storm, the gravity of what lay ahead settled heavily on her shoulders. The rumors had not been idle. Forces were gathering, not only from the remnants of the last dawn, but also from neighboring regions that saw Valmorn's fragile peace as a threat to their own ambitions. The whispers of rebellion, of revolution, were not just distant rumors. They were the seeds of something real, something dangerous. Yet, Elise's resolve did not falter. She had seen this coming, had felt the tension beneath the surface, the discontent simmering in pockets both inside the city and beyond its walls. What had once been a battle for survival had now become a battle for the very soul of the city. Would Valmorn remain a place of hope, of unity, or would it fall back into the chaos that had defined it for so long? Cashin approached her, his boots crunching softly on the gravel behind her. He stood beside her, looking out over the city with the same focused intensity. Though he had been by her side through countless battles, Elise could see that even he was weary. This was a different kind of fighter, fight that couldn't be one with swords or strategy alone. It was a fight for the hearts and minds of the people. We need to act fast, Cashin said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the distant horizon. If we wait too long, it will be too late. Elise nodded, her gaze never leaving the dimming landscape. I know. But we can't just fight them. We need to find a way to reach them too. Show them that their rebellion won't bring the change they think it will. The words felt heavy in her chest. She had already spent so much time to rebuild trust, to bridge divides. And now it seemed as if everything she had fought for was on the brink of collapse. The people who had once stood by her, who had helped her tear down the old regime, were now divided. Some still believed in the ideals she had championed, while others had fallen back into the old patterns of fear and violence. It was no longer just a matter of stopping the enemy. It was a matter of saving her city from itself. Cashin placed a hand on her shoulder, his presence grounding her in the moment. We can do this, Elise. You've done more than most could ever dream of. You've built something from nothing. This city, this new Velmorn, it's stronger than you realize. It's not just the walls that will hold it together. It's the people, and they're looking to you for leadership. Elise met his gaze, her heart pounding. She had always known that the true test of her leadership would come not in the battles she fought, but in how she navigated the difficult decisions that lay ahead. The war was not just against an external enemy. It was against the fractures within her own people. Her vision for Velmorn had to be stronger than the temptations of revenge, stronger than the desire for retribution. It had to be about unity, about healing old wounds instead of reopening them. I won't let them destroy what we've built, Elise said, her voice steady, though a sense of determination filled her chest. I won't let Velmorn fall back into the darkness. In the days that followed, Elise took decisive action. The first step was to reach out, not just to her inner circle, but to the people. She held another series of town halls, larger and more open than before. These were not just speeches of unity but direct conversations. She invited the dissenters, the radicals, the ones who were disillusioned with her leadership, to speak openly about their grievances. She didn't want to silence their voices. She wanted to hear them, to understand where they were coming from, and perhaps most importantly, to show them that she was not the enemy. Her heart raced as she walked into the hall, knowing that she would be facing individuals who held the power to tear down everything she had worked for. Yet, as she looked out over the sea of faces, she could sense the unease among them, the fear of a future that seemed uncertain. They were searching for something, but Elise knew that what they sought was not just leadership, it was hope. As she began speaking, her voice resonated through the hall, calm but firm. I know that many of you are angry. I know that there are those who believe that the peace we fought for is a lie, that it's fragile and easily broken. But I'm here to tell you that I've seen what this city can be when we come together. We've rebuilt from the ashes before. We can do it again. The room was quiet, the air thick with tension. Elise's words hung in the silence, each one weighed down with the burden of what they represented. She wasn't just asking for their trust. She was offering her own a trust in the people to rise above the divisions, to reject the old ways of hatred and power. I know that we've been through terrible things. I know that the scars run deep. But if we continue down this path of division, if we allow ourselves to be consumed by the same fears and hatred that led us to the brink once before, then we will never be free. We will never be the city we are meant to be. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for any sign of understanding, of recognition. There was a flicker, just a flicker of something in the eyes of the dissenters. It wasn't agreement, but it was a crack in the armor. It was a beginning. Cashin stood beside her, a silent support. He knew that this wasn't the end, that there was still much work to be done. But in that moment, as he watched Elise speak with such passion and conviction, he felt a renewed sense of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward for Valmorn, if they could face the darkness within and find the strength to choose something different. Days turned into weeks, and Elise's efforts to rebuild bridges began to show results. The dissenters, though still cautious and wary, began to soften. Some even began to join the discussions, sharing their own visions for the future. It was slow, painstaking work, but Elise remained resolute. She had learned that healing was never quick, that trust was never easily given, that the people were listening, and that was a victory in itself. Yet, even as peace seemed within reach, the storm clouds on the horizon still loomed. Word came from the outlying territories that the forces gathering against Valmorn were not only growing in number but also in strength. The rebellion was far from over. The air in Valmorn had begun to carry the weight of an unspoken promise. A promise that, despite the looming storm, the city would not bend, would not break. Elise could feel it in the energy of the people, the quiet determination in the streets, the steady rhythm of life continuing even as they all braced for the inevitable. This was no longer a city on the edge of destruction, but a city learning to stand firm, to face whatever came with open eyes and open hearts. Yet, as the weeks passed and the rumors of rebellion grew louder, there was a gnawing tension that refused to be ignored. The rebellion that had started as a whisper in the shadows had turned into something more organized, more insidious. Whispers of alliances forming in distant corners of the land, of forces rallying in secret, sent a chill through Elise's bones. It wasn't just the remnants of the last dawn. There were other factions too. People who felt that Valmorn's new path threatened the balance of power they had held for so long. Elise had known this might happen. After all, change was never welcomed by those who had built their lives on the status quo. And yet, despite all her preparation, she couldn't shake the feeling that the coming conflict would be more challenging than anything she had faced before. Cashin, ever loyal, stood at her side as they observed the map of the surrounding territories in the war room. His face, usually so calm and steady, was drawn tight with concern. The alliances are growing stronger. Elise, he said, his voice low, measured. They're sending messages, trying to rally more support. It's only a matter of time before they strike. Elise didn't look at him immediately. Instead, her gaze was fixed on the map, her mind working furiously. The city was surrounded by potential enemies, but Valmorn had one advantage they didn't: unity. Or at least she hoped it was still intact. She had spent months working to repair the internal rifts, but now the time had come to confront the external ones. "We'll prepare," she said quietly, her voice steel-edged, "but we won't let them drag us into their wars. We'll show them that the path forward is one of peace. We'll offer them a chance to come to the table." Cashin's brow furrowed, a skeptical glance crossing his features. "And if they refuse? If they come for us with everything they have?" Elise met his gaze, unwavering. "Then we will fight. But not just with weapons. We'll fight with our hearts, with everything we've built. And we will remind them why Valmorn is worth fighting for." As the threat of invasion drew nearer, Elise poured herself into strengthening the city's defenses. Training programs were organized for the citizens, regardless of their skill level. Every man and woman in Velmorn would be prepared to stand at the city's walls, to protect their home with more than just their bodies. They would fight with their minds, with their unity, and they would show the enemy that Velmorn was not simply a city. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people laid down their weapons and chose a different path, a path of unity and shared purpose. Elise worked tirelessly, knowing that every decision she made now would shape the future of the city. She met with commanders, strategists, and the leaders of the city's factions to coordinate their response. She didn't have the luxury of waiting for the enemy to make the first move. Velmorn needed to be ready. But as the days dragged on, Elise found herself struggling to balance the external threat with the internal pressure. The people of Velmorn, while united in many ways, still harbored lingering doubts, old wounds that had yet to heal. The radicals who had once followed the last dawn weren't the only ones who questioned her leadership. Even some of her closest allies wondered if they had taken the right path. There were murmurs of fear, of uncertainty. Would Velmorn truly survive this? Or would they be swallowed whole by the forces that sought to tear them down? Elise, exhausted from the constant strain, found herself returning once again to the quiet refuge of her chambers. There, in the solitude of her thoughts, she could feel the weight of the world pressing on her chest. Her leadership had been tested in ways she never imagined. That this was different. This wasn't just about surviving a rebellion. This was about saving the dream she had fought so hard to build. She had poured her heart and soul into, creating a city that could rise above the darkness, a city that could stand as a beacon for the future. But now, she wasn't sure if she had the strength to carry it through to the end. Cashin, sensing her weariness, entered the room silently, closing the door behind him. His presence, as always, was a steadying force, a reminder that she wasn't alone. He approached her cautiously, as if afraid that even the slightest movement might shatter the fragile composure she had maintained for so long. "You look like you haven't slept in days," he said softly, his voice laced with concern. Elise offered him a small, tired smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I haven't. There's too much to do, too much to prepare for. If the enemy strikes, I need to be ready. Velmorn needs me to be ready." Cashin sat beside her, his presence grounding her. "You've already done more than anyone could ask. You've brought this city back from the brink. You've led with strength, with compassion, and you've earned the trust of the people. Don't forget that." Elise sighed, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as she stared at the map before her. But what if that's not enough? What if they don't come to the table? What if they don't believe in what we've built? Cashin placed his hand on hers, a silent promise of solidarity. "Then we fight, but not with hate. We fight for what we believe in, for the future we've dreamed of. And we show them that there's more power in peace than there ever was in war." Elise closed her eyes, allowing the comfort of his words to sink in. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future held. But in that moment, she understood something profound. The strength of Velmorn was not in its walls, its armies, or its weapons. It was in the hearts of its people, in their capacity for unity and hope. And with that, she knew what she had to do. In the following days, Elise called for one final summit meeting between the leaders of Velmorn and the representatives of the rebellious factions. She knew it was a risk, that many would see it as an act of weakness, of surrender. But she also knew that if there was a chance, however small, to avoid the coming war, to find a solution that could preserve the peace she had worked so hard to create, she had to take it. As the summit approached, Elise stood once again before her people, not as a conqueror but as a leader, who understood the weight of the choices before her. The city was silent, waiting. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her citizens. Soldiers, rebels, all of them watching, hoping, uncertain. "This is our chance," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "This is our chance to prove that we are stronger than the forces that seek to divide us. We have fought for peace. We have fought for a future that is better than the past we've left behind. And now, we have the chance to take that final step." The crowd was silent, but in their eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Hope. A hope that, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, they were willing to follow her one last time. And with that, the future of Velmorn rested on the balance of a single moment. The moment when unity could be forged once again, or when everything would be lost. The summit would decide everything. As the summit day arrived, the air was thick with anticipation. Elise walked into the grand hall, her heart pounding in her chest. The leaders of the rebellious factions were seated on one side, their faces stern, their eyes filled with suspicion. On the other side, the representatives of Velmorn, those who had worked tirelessly to build the city's new foundation, sat in quiet solidarity. Elise knew that this moment could tip the scales, either toward peace or destruction. She stood before them all, every ounce of her strength focused on the task at hand. She wasn't just leading a city anymore, she was leading a dream. The dream of a world where hatred could be set aside for the common good, where the past's wounds could be healed, and where, together, they could build something far greater than any one individual. "Thank you all for coming," Elise began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know that the path that has brought us here today has been long and painful. There are scars on this city, and there are scars on each of us. We've all lost something, some more than others. But it is in the wake of our losses that we must decide what kind of people we will be. Will we remain divided, bound by the past? Or will we look to the future and see that our unity, our shared purpose, is stronger than any fear or hatred that lingers between us?" The room was silent as her words hung in the air. Even the rebels, who had long been distrustful of her leadership, seemed to hesitate. Elise could see it in their eyes, the flicker of doubt, of something more vulnerable than the hardened exterior they had maintained for so long. They were not so different from the people of Velmorn, after all. They too had suffered. They too had fought for what they believed was right. "I do not ask for your trust lightly," Elise continued, her voice unwavering. "I ask for it because I believe, with all my heart, that together, we can be more than the sum of our fears. We can create something that the world has never seen before, an example of what it means to overcome our differences, to build not on the ashes of war, but on the foundation of hope and unity. But for that to happen, we must each let go of the old ways, the ways that brought us to the edge of destruction. We must be willing to forgive, to take the first step, and to build this future together." A tense silence followed her words. Elise could feel the weight of history, pressing down on them, all the weight of every battle, every loss, every failed attempt at peace. But in that silence, something shifted. Slowly, one by one, The representatives of the rebellious factions rose to their feet. Elise watched as they met her gaze, each of them carrying the burden of their past decisions. The first to speak was a man from the outer territories, a leader who had once been part of the last dawn. His voice was gruff but honest. "I came here today expecting to see a city crumbling under the weight of its own lies," he said, his eyes hard, but his tone softer than she had anticipated. "But what I see instead is something different. You've built something, Elise. I don't know if it's strong enough to survive this world, but I'll give you this. It's worth fighting for." The others nodded in agreement, their faces still uncertain, but their hearts clearly moved. The path ahead wasn't easy, but it was no longer just a fight for power. It was a fight for something greater than any of them had imagined. They were standing at a crossroads, each of them holding the key to either peace or more war. Elise felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of relief, a tear for the possibility of something beautiful, being born from all the pain. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for giving us the chance to make this right." And just like that, the tension in the room began to ease. The walls that had divided them, both literal and metaphorical, began to crumble. The representatives, once bitter and divided, began to speak to each other not as enemies, but as people who shared a common goal, the future of Velmorn. The days that followed were not without their challenges. The agreement reached that the summit was fragile, and the work of rebuilding trust would take time. That the seeds had been planted, and with each passing day, those seeds began to sprout. The rebels who had once sworn to destroy the city now worked side by side with the citizens of Velmorn, each of them learning that the true strength of a city did not lie in its walls or its weapons, but in its people, their willingness to rise above their pasts and to build a shared future. Velmorn began to heal, slowly and with great effort, but it healed nonetheless. The fractures that had threatened to tear the city apart were mended, not by force, but by understanding, by dialogue, and by the collective will of its people. Elise, though still weary from the weight of her journey, found herself at peace. She had led not with the might of her armies or the power of her position, but with the strength of her heart. She had learned, over the course of these trials, that leadership was not about commanding others. It was about lifting them up, about guiding them toward a future they could build together. Years later, Velmorn stood as a testament to the power of unity over division, of forgiveness over vengeance. It wasn't a perfect city, and its people weren't perfect, but they had learned something invaluable, that no matter how broken the world may seem, it is never too late to rebuild. And as Elise walked through the bustling streets, now filled with the sounds of laughter and life, she realized that the true victory was not in the battles they had fought, but in the quiet moments of peace they had fought for, moments that, though fleeting, were the very essence of what it meant to be human. In the end, the greatest power lies not in the sword or the crown, but in the hearts of those who choose to rise above their past, to forgive, and to build something greater than themselves. It is in unity, in understanding, and in the courage to choose hope over fear, that we find our true strength. The path to peace is not easy, but it is always worth walking together.